Salam from the People's Dispatch Studios in New Delhi. You're watching Daily Debrief. First up, the launch on Thursday of a long-range intercontinental ballistic missile, or ICBM, by North Korea is the latest test in what appears to be an escalating situation in the Korean peninsula. Reportedly flying for some 67 minutes, the missile reached a height 15 times higher than the International Space Station before splashing down into the Sea of Japan. The test highlights an expanding North Korean missile development program that has made significant gains over the past few years. Since 2017, North Korea has showed the world it's capable of fielding several types of successive missiles with improved range, payload and other capabilities. Successful road, rail and even submarine-launched missile tests demonstrate the capability the DPRK has to retaliate in case it comes under attack. Prabir, you've been following the situation. Firstly, there's been some skepticism, particularly if you look at South Korean and Western media, about the validity of the test itself. What does your information tell you?
Well, I think this was a set of tests which were being conducted. It started about a month back, and there were a set of tests which were being observed, but people didn't know what it was.
Right.
And there was some talk that it could be the Hwasong 17, which is the one which has finally been claimed by North Korea, which was demonstrated about in 2020, about 2 years back. So this test has been in the offing for some time, and after Hwasong 15, this was the next range of missiles they're supposedly demonstrating. When it was shown in the parade, which is when we saw the prototypes of it being shown,
Right.
it was relatively a large missile, larger than what the earlier versions were.
Right.
So if we go by what the claims are, this is a liquid-filled missile, liquid propellant, and that would make it the largest liquid propellant missile of its kind.
Right.
So that is one thing. The trajectory which has been talked about, it's went up to about more than 6,000 kilometers, and it came down. This is what's called normally when you test missiles like this, you test on a high angle altitude, so that it goes up and comes down.
Right.
So the missile is tested, but it doesn't take the flat trajectory, which would convert it to what a normal trajectory would be for a missile. Then it could be up to 15,000 kilometers, which it means it brings United States completely under its range. Now, the point about all of this is, whenever North Korea has demonstrated some claims like this, initially people have pooh-poohed it. But at the end of it, finally they have accepted, yes, it seems to be what they are claiming. So I think in this case too, from what we can see of the evidence, that they have been carefully building up to this and they have demonstrated the capability.
Yeah.
And if they do demonstrate this capability, then it changes the equation between the United States and North Korea, that even if they are not able to destroy the United States, they can't, and the United States can certainly destroy North Korea. The question is, does it give them a protection against the United States? And the argument is yes, because unfortunately that is the logic of deterrence, that I can damage you to the extent that you cannot accept the damage of this kind. So if we take that, then yes. Is it possible for the United States to be able to shoot down such a missile with its anti-ballistic missiles? There was a 3 months, 4 months back, there was a long report.
Which we discussed on the show as well.
Discussed on the show as well. And the considered opinion of the experts in the United States was that's unlikely that we can do that in the foreseeable future. So given that, and the fact that it's possible for such a missile to take evasive action of different kinds, release decoys and so on, so that unlikely that you could actually talk about being able to stop it. So I think this qualitatively changes the equation and brings back what North Korea has been asking, that after all the discussions that Trump was supposed to progress further and go towards a peace agreement, instead of what we have is an armistice which has lasted for more than 50, 60, 70 years. 70 years. So that this should be converted to a peace agreement, and there should be finally South Korea should have independence militarily from the United States, it still controls its military. And then both sides should go towards peace. Of course, a spanner in the works is the president who has won
The
right
new
now,
government
the
in
new
South Korea.
president.
Right.
He's much more hawkish, unlike President Moon, who was relatively more inclined to be towards peace and reapproach more with North Korea. So it's also a climate which is not very conducive to North Korea and peace, both with South Korea under the new leadership, as well as Biden and his whole focus now on Ukraine and China. So North Korea is not on the radar.
Right.
So therefore, I think their argument or their understanding is that unless we protect ourselves, we are not going to be protected, and therefore the trajectory of an isolated hermit kingdom, the picture that the world has of it, is going to continue.
Right.
And the fact that they have been able to do it on their own, this is at least an acceptance that neither missiles nor nuclear weapons are that difficult technologically. The question is, should countries have it? Should countries proceed in this direction? Or should we really look back and say, okay, we went off in the wrong direction, we need to come towards peace? Looking at what's happened in Ukraine and what we see in South China Sea and on the Taiwan issue, doesn't look like we're progressing towards peace, so we seem to be going towards more unhappy times.
What we see in South Asia also from time to time. Prabir, you've given the context quite well, I think. Just in terms of, because so much of the conversation is revolved around an arms race that is sort of reigniting or escalating on the peninsula. What exactly is fueling this race from both the North and the South's perspective?
See, essentially, the United States believes, and this is why they have used South Korea from 50s onwards, that the regime change in North Korea is possible. Just as they seem to believe a regime change in
Russia today
is possible when Biden said this man must go. Now that's really asking for regime change. Or it's believed that China, whatever system they're building, can be subverted and can be defeated. So these are all the basic arguments that the United States had for a long time. And it is really post-1992, the recasting of the world towards a sole hegemon model, that has still not been buried as far as US thinking is concerned. And the economic sanctions we are seeing are basically an indicator of that after all, these were sovereign funds of Russia. So if you take it away, of course it's been done earlier in Afghanistan, with the Venezuelan gold, with Libya earlier, with Iran. So history is there, but doing it to Russia is a big country. So I think that concept of the super hegemon hasn't gone. And that a small country cannot, like North Korea, can challenge it is something that the United States does not want to accept. That's really the problem. And unfortunately, North Korea has paid the price because it did defeat, effectively, of course, with Chinese support, the United States in Korea. In fact, when they crossed the 30th parallel, they were asked not to cross it. And they crossed it. We remember at that time, General MacArthur, I think, who was heading the US in that war, he had said if the Chinese intervene, and the Chinese had threatened that if you cross 38th parallel, we will intervene, that we'll slaughter the Chinese. And as some commentators wrote later, the slaughter was great, but not of the Chinese, because it really did, of course, see a lot of losses. The United States also suffered losses. And the entire North Korea was flattened. In fact, later on, the general who was really leading the war said that we didn't have anything left to bomb, that everything that we had flattened. So all of that is there in the minds of the North Korean people. And therefore, they're not going to accept that, that live under the American sword continuously, and they don't have any protection against it. In their view, therefore, protection finally was nuclear weapons and the ability to reach the United States, delivery platform, and therefore hoping that now that there is a certain degree of equality, not in terms of reach and capacity, but in terms of being able to inflict damage, and therefore the strategic equation has been rewritten. I believe it has. It has been rewritten for quite some time. But unfortunately, unless the United States is willing to accept it and does not believe that this is all a temporary issue and we can really have a regime change in North Korea,
Right.
I think that we are going to see this tension continue. Unfortunately, it also means South Korea and Japan are
Yeah.
going to be on the front lines.
Yeah.
It's their call how to get out of the front lines and look for peace. It's as much in their interest as North Korea's.
Thanks so much for that, Prabir. I'll ask you to stick around because next up we're going to be doing our regular COVID-19 global update. The big story, of course, is Shanghai, where the local government have announced a new lockdown. It's a two-phase lockdown which was announced on Sunday based on an Omicron-driven COVID outbreak that has resulted in China facing its highest caseloads since the early days of the pandemic. The city of 26 million, which is the largest in China, will shut down its eastern half for 5 days of intensive testing from today onwards. The western side will similarly be shut on Friday. Numbers in the city, it must be remembered, are still around the 3,000 new cases per day mark if we also consider those that are asymptomatic. Overall, China is reporting around 6,000 cases, which doesn't include Hong Kong. Hong Kong, of course, tracks its cases separately. Prabir has been tracking the pandemic throughout from day one. Prabir, how do we understand the latest Chinese numbers and this call for a lockdown in Shanghai in the context of China's no COVID, zero COVID policy?
Yeah, if we did not have the zero COVID policies, these numbers would be very, very small.
Right.
Because there are something like active cases which are about 50, 60 per day, while there are asymptomatic cases which could be around 3.5, what we see, what you just said. So normal cases we would consider only symptomatic cases, ask the rest to stay at home, and we'll only worry about those who could be hospitalized. This is what we have been doing in the rest of the world.
Right.
China, because it's a no COVID policy, they want to identify all those who could be symptomatic and transmitting the virus to others, and therefore they need to identify everybody.
Right.
Therefore, this whole lockdown that we are talking about is really to do a city of more than 20 million people.
26 million.
26 million people, each one to be tested. And therefore identify which are the areas we are seeing the transmissions, lock them down separately, or after this testing lockdown is over, only lock down those micro-containment, as in India we call them,
Right.
micro-containment zones, and therefore be able to stop the transmission. They have done it earlier in Beijing, they have done it in other cities also. The scale of the problem, of course, is much larger because it's Shanghai.
Big city.
It's also an Omicron variant which has not been that dangerous. And unlike Hong Kong, where the older people were not vaccinated, a lot of them were not vaccinated, China has vaccinated much more in all of these places. So the older people are not vulnerable as they were in Hong Kong, which therefore suffered relatively more.
Right.
So I don't see that as a policy as a problem for the way they are going. Yes, China's zero COVID policy, can it contain Omicron? That was the big question mark. And that, I think the test is really Shanghai. If they can contain it in Shanghai, yes, they will continue the zero COVID policies. And I do think that the way they are organized, because it's not, as people like to believe, it's a totalitarian regime which does everything to the top. It is the local level, what would be called in our kind of things, the mohalla committees, the local bodies, all of this combined together. And a lot of them are basically the people coming together to organize, support, and provide all the necessities that are required in order to be able to maintain such lockdowns, which is what they're doing. So I think this has to be understood as local government, people's organizations, and the central government all working together to institute such a no COVID policy. But the scale at which they can mobilize, that is quite astounding. And I think that's something that we all have to learn from. Even if we don't follow no COVID policies, the fact that they can even think of testing a city of 26 million people in 5 days. Now that's something which is very, very amazing in the sense of the quality of the mobilization. the scale of the mobilization. And I think that we have to give China the credit for that, because all others who have tried no COVID policies, South Korea did manage to contain the COVID earlier outbreaks. Now it's again, this outbreak has taken them to huge numbers,
high numbers,
300,000 and so on per day. And others like New Zealand and so on who tried also have finally given up when it comes to the Omicron variant. So we have to see whether China is able to defeat, as it has been till now, the Omicron variant. Shanghai is really their biggest test.
Of course, Prabir, maybe next week when we get into this, we can discuss how that fits in with a world that kind of also is moving around and sort of moving from one place to the other, which is how these transmissions also are spreading. But for now, you've also been looking at global numbers, and what are those numbers saying? Is there anything noteworthy for this week that we need to kind of consider?
Well, once the world has, or large parts of the world has decided to dispense with the kind of COVID policies that were being followed, isolation, masking, and so on.
Testing even.
Testing. All of that has been relaxed to the extent that people think it's over. But clearly it's not over. So the different variants of Omicron are now circulating, and what is being called the BA2 variant, that seems to have spread in a number of European countries, also in East Asia and Southeast Asia. But it's also there in the United States, it's also there in UK, it's also there in Germany, it's in number of NATO countries, as it were, because we are having the current war, and in Russia. So you have a large number of countries where the daily caseload is not low. And we must understand one thing, that also the testing, because of home kits and other things, a lot of the test results do not appear in the national tests. So the results which, for instance, the US government might give does not have really what if you test yourself at home and find that you're sick or you're asymptomatic, but you're positive. It doesn't reflect in the national numbers. So we are probably seeing an underestimate of the actual numbers. But what is important here is, while this is going on, the hospitalization numbers seem to be lower, at least those who are because of COVID, not because they've got in for other things, and they also are found to be COVID infected, COVID positive. So that is one. And the number of deaths have come down, mainly because Omicron variant is less damaging, and it doesn't have that kind of severe illness that the earlier variants had. Also, plus we have some protection due to vaccination and earlier infections. Because of all of that, we have more protection. Our immune system is not as naive as it was when the initial COVID-19 pandemic started. But we are no means out of the woods, and I think that's important to recognize, because you could get a variant now which comes up again, which, considering the infections that they're all over, it can emerge again just as the Omicron variant did. And you could have a situation where it becomes more virulent, not just simply transmissible. Omicron is more transmissible. The version going around now is even more transmissible. But it is not more virulent in terms of the effect it has on our bodies, but that could also change. So I think all bets are off if a new variant arises. Unfortunately, till we really get over the pandemic and vaccinate large sections of the population, say in a continent like Africa, where only 10 to 15% have been vaccinated, that you are going to see these new variants emerge time and again. So I think we have to move towards a public health policy which takes all of this into account.
Right. Thanks so much, Prabir, for that. Right, that's all we have on this episode of Daily Debrief. For more details on all of these stories, head on over to our website, peoplesdispatch.org. And of course, give us a follow on all your regular social media platforms, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, etc. For updates on the work we do. We'll be back again, same time, same place tomorrow. Until then, stay safe. Goodbye.